a gem. It is something like I've never seen in Arizona.
For 96 years, a concrete dam in central Arizona diverted almost every drop of water from a desert creek that had been flowing for thousands of years. The stream bed went dry. The turquoise pools that once defined the canyon shrank to almost nothing. The native fish that had evolved in this one specific stream, nowhere else on Earth, started vanishing. Then, in 2005, Arizona did something almost nobody in the American Southwest had ever done. They shut the dam down, pulled out the flumes, gave the river its water back. What that creek did next didn't just surprise the scientists watching it. It rewrote what they thought they knew about how fast a dead ecosystem can come back to life. And it did it in a state where almost every other conversation about water ends with someone taking more of it, not giving it away. The creek that builds stone. The creek is called Fossil Creek, and it cuts through a canyon deep enough to stack the Statue of Liberty inside it 4 times over. There are no fossils here, despite the name. What early travelers found were twigs and leaves wrapped in pale shells of rock that looked petrified. They were actually travertine, a form of limestone the water itself deposits as it flows. Fossil Creek carries water so loaded with dissolved calcium that it builds solid rock wherever the current slows down. The source is a cluster of springs at the base of the canyon, and everything about this place traces back to them. Those springs push out roughly 20,000 gallons every minute, a steady 43 cubic feet per second, every hour of every day, in drought and in flood, at a constant 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, in a state where most rivers vanish by midsummer. That kind of reliability shouldn't exist in the desert. The water simply appears out of the rock, and it never stops. Where the flow slows against a log or a bend, the calcium hardens into pale ledges of stone, sealing leaves and twigs inside them. Over centuries, this process built natural terraces across the stream bed, holding back pools that glow turquoise in the desert light. Roughly 13 tons of fresh travertine gets laid down along the creek every single day, making it the 4th largest travertine-forming system in the United States. That endless, patient flow built Fossil Creek into the most biologically diverse riparian corridor in Arizona. More than 30 species of trees and shrubs on its banks. More than 100 species of birds moving through every year. All of it, the springs, the stone, the life that grew up around them, had been running uninterrupted for thousands of years before anyone thought to put it to use. What makes this kind of travertine system genuinely rare is the specific chemistry required to sustain it. Most groundwater carries some dissolved minerals, but Fossil Creek springs push through a particular sequence of limestone bedrock that loads the water with calcium carbonate at a concentration few other spring systems in North America can match. When that mineral-saturated water hits open air and slows down even slightly, carbon dioxide escapes from the water the same way it escapes from an opened soda bottle, and the calcium that had been dissolved in solution suddenly has nowhere to go but out, hardening directly onto whatever surface happens to be sitting in the current. A fallen branch, a rock ledge, the edge of a pool. Run that same chemical process continuously for thousands of years, and you get an entire canyon quietly building its own architecture out of moving water, terrace by terrace, without a single person ever laying a hand on it. So how do you kill a place like that? How do you kill a place like that? You file a piece of paper. That's genuinely all it took. Archaeologists have found signs of human presence in the watershed going back perhaps 10,000 years. Yavapai and Apache peoples made their home here and still regard the canyon as ancestral ground. Then, in 1900, a rancher named Lou Turner filed a claim on the creek. A year later, he claimed the springs at the headwaters outright. The mining towns nearby, Jerome, Clarkdale, Crown King, needed electricity, and a spring that never stopped flowing looked like a resource going to waste. What followed was one of the strangest construction projects in Arizona's history. The nearest railroad stop sat in Mayer, more than 40 miles away, across mountains and canyon country with no road connecting them. So the crews built one. More than 400 mules and 600 men hauled over 150 wagons along a trail carved directly into raw terrain. Most of the laborers were Apache and Mojave men, hauling turbines and cement into a canyon that dropped 1,600 feet from rim to water. Men and animals died on that trail. A bond issue raised $1.5 million, and the Child's Power Plant came online on June 21, 1909. A second plant, Irving, followed between 1915 and 1916. To feed both, the creek was funneled through 8,800 feet of flumes, and a 25-foot dam near the springs captured almost the entire stream. By 1920, the Childs and Irving plants together supplied roughly 70% of the electricity for the fast-growing city of Phoenix. Streetlights, streetcars, and the valley's first air conditioners all drew their current from water welling up in a limestone canyon 100 miles away. A small desert creek was quietly powering one of the fastest expanding cities in the American West. The plants were later named a historic mechanical engineering landmark in 1976 and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1991. It's worth pausing on how completely normal this all looked at the time. Nobody involved in building the Childs and Irving plants thought of themselves as destroying anything. They thought of themselves as solving a real, immediate problem. A booming desert city with no reliable source of power, and a spring 100 miles away that appeared, by every measure available to an engineer in 1909, to be running to waste. The entire framework for evaluating a project like this, then, measured success in kilowatts delivered and awards won, with essentially no formal mechanism for weighing the cost to the fish, the travertine, or the ecosystem. The diversion was quietly strangling downstream. That blind spot wasn't unique to Fossil Creek. It was the operating assumption behind nearly every dam built across the American West in the first half of the 20th century. And it's a large part of why so many of those same dams are only now, generations later, being reconsidered. But while the turbines were earning awards, the creek below the dam was vanishing. Ghost water. With almost all of its flow pulled into the flumes, the stream bed downstream ran at a trickle, sometimes as little as 1 or 2 cubic feet per second, where the full natural flow should have been 43 or more. The travertine stopped forming. The turquoise pools shrank. Native fish that had evolved in this one specific stream and nowhere else were squeezed into a fraction of their old habitat, while non-native species that had been introduced elsewhere in the watershed moved in to prey on them and outcompete them for what little remained. For a creek whose entire identity was built on turning water into stone, this wasn't simple decline. It was erasure, and it went on for the better part of a century, while the dam kept collecting engineering awards on paper somewhere else. The species caught in the middle of that erasure deserve a closer look, because they weren't generic river fish that happened to be passing through. The Sonora sucker, the desert sucker, the round-tail chub, the speckled dace, all of them had spent thousands of years adapting specifically to Fossil Creek's unusual conditions. Its constant year-round temperature, its unusually clear, mineral-rich water, its particular mix of deep travertine pools and fast riffles. That kind of specialization is a double-edged evolutionary trait. It made these fish extraordinarily well-suited to a river that almost never changes. It also meant they had nowhere else to go, and no backup population elsewhere in the state to fall back on once their home stopped functioning. When the flow dropped to a trickle, these weren't fish that could simply relocate downstream to better conditions. The trickle was the only fossil creek there was. By the 1990s, the two power plants were old, and on the scale of a modern electrical grid, they generated an almost trivial amount of power. Environmental groups pressed the point that diverting the creek had wrecked its travertine formations, shrunk its wetlands, and driven native species toward collapse. Arizona Public Service, the utility that had come to own both plants, weighed the cost of relicensing century-old infrastructure against the modest power those turbines still produced. In 1999, the company agreed to decommission both plants entirely and return the full natural flow of Fossil Creek to its original course. No court forced this. No lawsuit compelled it. The utility chose to give the river back. In a region where water is the single most fought-over resource there is, a company voluntarily surrendering 20,000 gallons a minute was almost unheard of. This was only the second time in United States history that a dam had been dismantled purely for environmental reasons. The first had come just 6 years earlier, with the removal of the Edwards Dam in Maine. But that project had cleared a migration path for fish with real commercial and recreational value, species people fished for and sold. Fossil Creek was different. The fish it was meant to save, the suckers, the dace, the chub, had almost no market value at all. This was restoration purely for its own sake, and that made plenty of people question whether it was worth the roughly $13 million it would end up costing. At the ceremony marking the shutdown, Vincent Randall, a Yavapai Apache tribal historian and councilman, stood at the edge of the canyon where his ancestors had hauled cement and turbines up a trail that had killed men and mules alike a century earlier. The crowd went quiet as he spoke. His people had built this dam, he told them, and had been proud of what it accomplished across the decades that followed. But its time had passed. He asked the creek for forgiveness. The purge. Here's the thing about restoring a river. You cannot simply flip the water back on and hope for the best. By 2004, the stretch below the dam was full of non-native fish that would multiply the instant full flows returned, finishing off the very native species the entire effort was meant to rescue. So before anyone touched the dam itself, close to 100 people, working alongside the Forest Service, Arizona Game and Fish, and researchers from Northern Arizona University, went into the starved creek and physically cleared it of everything that didn't belong. They built a barrier downstream to stop those invasive fish from moving back in once the water returned. The sequence was deliberate, and it explains why the recovery worked at all. Strip the creek of what didn't belong, hold the line at the barrier, and only then hand the native fish the one thing they'd been denied for nearly a century. Their river, in full, exactly as it had been before 1901. This step is easy to skip over in the retelling, but it's arguably the single most decisive decision in the entire restoration. Plenty of well-intentioned dam removal and flow restoration projects across the country have skipped exactly this stage, either for lack of funding or lack of foresight, and watched invasive species simply expand right alongside the native ones once the water came back, occupying the newly restored habitat just as effectively as the fish the project was meant to save. Fossil Creek's planners understood, going in, that restoring the water without first clearing the competition wouldn't be restoration at all. It would just be handing a larger battlefield to whichever species already had the advantage. The barrier built downstream in 2004 wasn't a minor engineering footnote. It was the single piece of infrastructure that determined whether everything that happened afterward would actually work. The comeback. Here's what made this different from virtually every other dam removal in the country. Researchers had positioned themselves on Fossil Creek years before the water was ever turned back on. Restoration projects are almost never studied this carefully. because scientists rarely know years in advance exactly which river is about to change and exactly when. Here they did. For years before the shutoff, the research team measured the starved creek in painstaking detail, tracking its chemistry, its fish populations, and its rock-building process against a healthy reference stretch upstream that had continued running at full flow the entire time. Essentially, a built-in control group for measuring exactly how far the damaged section had fallen, and exactly how far it would need to climb back. On June 18, 2005, Arizona Public Service shut off the flume for the final time. For the first time since 1909, the full weight of Fossil Springs ran down its own canyon, unassisted. It didn't crash through all at once. It crept, finding its way downstream, filling the nooks and pools and side channels one by one, while researchers and a crowd of locals watched it come. This was the first time a desert stream anywhere in the American Southwest had been handed back its complete, unmodified natural flow. Nobody had a playbook for what would happen next. What nobody expected was the speed. Researchers had braced for a recovery that might unfold across decades. Instead, they watched fundamental ecosystem processes snap back almost immediately. Photosynthesis in the stream climbed. The creek's ability to process nutrients returned to levels matching the healthy reaches upstream, not across years, but across a matter of seasons. The lesson buried inside that data was simple, and it was radical. A river is not a machine that stays broken forever once you break it. Give it back its water, and a striking amount of the damage simply undoes itself. That finding mattered well beyond Fossil Creek's own canyon walls, because it challenged an assumption that had quietly shaped river restoration policy for decades. The conventional expectation among ecologists going into a project like this was that a century of accumulated damage would demand a correspondingly long recovery, that ecosystems degrade slowly and rebuild slowly on roughly matching timelines. Fossil Creek's data broke that symmetry. Degradation and recovery, it turned out, don't have to move at the same speed at all. A river can be strangled gradually over 100 years and still come roaring back within a handful of seasons, provided the underlying structure, the spring flow, the bedrock chemistry, the basic shape of the channel, never actually stopped existing underneath the damage the whole time. The dam hadn't destroyed Fossil Creek's capacity to be Fossil Creek. It had only been suppressing it, and suppression, it turns out, can end far faster than it began. The travertine told the same story, written in stone instead of chemistry. Along the stretches that had been starved for decades, the mineral-building process had gone completely dormant. Once the flow returned, it started again almost immediately. New travertine terraces began rising along a 6-mile run below the springs, some growing more than 2 centimeters a year. The turquoise pools that had once defined the entire canyon started refilling and deepening. Water was turning back into rock at a pace you could track with a ruler. What the fish did next, but the numbers that actually stopped people in their tracks came from the fish. With the invasive species removed, the barrier holding firm, and the full natural flow restored, the native species that had been clinging to survival for the better part of a century didn't just recover. They exploded. Sonora suckers multiplied roughly 17-fold. Desert suckers climbed around 52-fold. The round-tail chub, a fish that had been circling local extinction in this stretch of river, came back approximately 70-fold. And the speckled dace, a small, unglamorous native minnow that had nearly blinked out of the canyon entirely, increased on the order of 150-fold. Sit with that math for a second. A population that had been sitting on the edge of vanishing came back more than 100 times over in the span of a few years, not decades. Today, Fossil Creek is home to 9 native fish species and holds a distinction no other stretch of river in Arizona can match. It is the longest reach of river in the entire state, where the native fish community is completely free of non-native competitors. The restored corridor now supports somewhere near 200 species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. In the 50-acre botanical area surrounding the springs alone, researchers have cataloged 166 separate species of plants. A creek that had been quietly dying below its own dam had become one of the richest, most biologically dense pockets of life anywhere in the American Southwest. What makes numbers like 17-fold and 150-fold possible in a time frame measured in years rather than generations comes down to something biologists call source and refuge dynamics. Even at its most starved, Fossil Creek never lost every single individual of each native species. Small, stressed, barely hanging on populations persisted in isolated pools and side channels throughout the drought years, functioning as a kind of biological seed bank. The whole time, nobody was watching closely. The moment full flow and connected habitat returned, those survivors didn't need to rebuild a population from zero. They needed to expand into habitat that had simply become available again. And fish, unlike slower reproducing animals, can do that with remarkable speed. Multiple spawning events a year, rapid maturation, and no predator pressure from the invasive species that had just been physically removed from the system. It's the ecological equivalent of a packed waiting room suddenly getting every door in the building thrown open at once. And then the people showed up. Loved to death. In 2009, Congress designated nearly 17 miles of Fossil Creek as a wild and scenic river, one of only 2 stretches in the entire state of Arizona to carry that federal protection. But a place with clear, warm, turquoise water sitting in the middle of the high desert proved almost impossible for people to resist. Thousands of visitors began pouring into the canyon every year, trampling the banks, leaving trash behind, and straining the very ecosystem the restoration effort had spent years rebuilding from almost nothing. Think about the strange shape of that outcome for a moment. A river that had survived a full-scale hydroelectric empire, that had outlasted a 100-year-old concrete dam and come back stronger than anyone predicted, was now being worn down by people in water shoes carrying coolers. The Forest Service responded with an increasingly strict system of permits and reservations that caps how many people are allowed into the canyon on any given day. Having saved the creek from being drained to death, its stewards now find themselves having to save it from being loved to death instead. A completely different kind of pressure, but a pressure all the same. There's an irony worth sitting with here that a lot of restoration stories quietly skip past. The entire appeal that draws thousands of visitors to Fossil Creek every year, the impossibly clear water, the turquoise pools, the sense of having stumbled into somewhere untouched, exists specifically because of the restoration effort those same visitors are now straining. A river degraded enough to be unremarkable draws no crowds at all. A river restored back to its full, striking natural condition becomes, almost immediately, a victim of its own success. Managing that tension, protecting a recovering ecosystem from the very popularity its recovery generates, has become as much a part of Fossil Creek's ongoing story as the dam removal ever was. The springs, for their part, don't care about any of it. They are still running exactly as they have for thousands of years, 20,000 gallons a minute, turning water back into stone, indifferent to dams, indifferent to permits, indifferent to the century of human argument that has played out along their banks. One decision, made in 1999 to stop taking, to pull down the concrete, and to let a river simply be a river again, rebuilt one of the most remarkable ecosystems in the country. And it did it faster than the people who study rivers for a living thought was possible. What Fossil Creek shares with the biggest dam removal in American history. Fossil Creek wasn't an isolated case, and understanding what it shares with the country's other major dam removals helps explain why its recovery was as fast and complete as it was. In 2011 and 2012, the two largest dam removal projects ever attempted in the United States took down the Elwha and Glines Canyon dams on Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, structures that had blocked the Elwha River for nearly a century, cutting off what had once been some of the largest salmon runs on the entire West Coast. That project, decades in the planning and costing well over $300 million, offered a similar lesson at a vastly larger scale. Within a few years of full removal, salmon were documented spawning in stretches of river they hadn't reached in 100 years, and sediment trapped behind the dams for generations, rebuilt beaches and estuary habitat almost as fast as engineers could measure it. The common thread isn't the size of the dam or the price tag. It's the underlying biological principle both projects proved independently. Rivers carry an enormous, latent capacity for self-repair, one that stays completely hidden for as long as the dam stands, and reveals itself almost immediately once the barrier comes down. What made Fossil Creek's case unusual wasn't its speed relative to the Elwha. It was the size of the population increases relative to how small and specialized the affected species were. Salmon runs in a system as large as the Elwha move in the tens of thousands. Fossil Creek's native fish, confined to a single narrow desert canyon with nowhere else on the planet to draw a rescue population from, had far less margin between struggling and extinct, which is exactly what made the numbers 17-fold, 52-fold, 150-fold land as hard as they did. The dams nobody's talking about yet. There are, by some counts, more than 90,000 dams across the United States, large enough to be tracked in the federal government's own inventory, and the overwhelming majority were built in the same narrow window as Fossil Creek's, the first half of the 20th century, for reasons that made complete sense at the time, and have quietly stopped making sense since. A significant share no longer served the purpose they were originally built for, generating a trickle of power against maintenance costs that outweigh what that power is even worth on today's grid, or standing with no active function beyond continuing to block a river that would very likely still like to move. Removing a dam is never simple, and Fossil Creek's own $13 million price tag is a reminder that giving a river back is rarely as cheap as it sounds in a single sentence. But Fossil Creek, alongside the Elwha, and a growing list of smaller projects across the country, has given river ecologists something they didn't reliably have a generation ago: hard evidence, measured in real fish counts and real travertine growth rates, that when removal is done carefully, the return on that investment can arrive faster and larger than almost anyone studying these systems expected. There's a broader question sitting underneath Fossil Creek's specific story, one that reaches well beyond this one Arizona canyon. The American West is dotted with aging dams built for exactly the same reasons this one was: a resource that looked like it was going to waste, a growing city that needed power, an engineering solution nobody thought too hard about at the time. Many of those dams now generate a fraction of the power they were built for, against ecological costs that have only become fully visible decades later, once the damage had already compounded season after season. The math that made a company voluntarily walk away from an asset it had owned for the better part of a century is, on its face, a strange kind of arithmetic. A plant generating a small, aging trickle of power, weighed against the reputational and regulatory cost of continuing to strangle a river that, by the 1990s, had become impossible to defend on paper. Fossil Creek is proof of what's possible when a utility, a tribal community, and a research team all agree that a river's time as infrastructure has quietly come to an end. It is not proof that every dam should come down, and it is not proof that recovery is guaranteed everywhere water is restored. What it proves is narrower and arguably more important precisely because it's narrower. That when the conditions are right, when the invasive species are cleared first, when the barrier holds, when the flow comes back in full rather than in careful hedged fractions, an ecosystem that took a century to nearly disappear can find its way back in the span of a few ordinary seasons, faster than the people watching it happen ever thought to expect. Should more aging dams across the American West come down? Or is the cost of removal simply too high to justify against everything else competing for that same funding? There's a lot of wild left in this country still worth paying attention to, and Fossil Creek is proof that some of the most remarkable recoveries are happening in canyons most people will never hear about, let alone visit.